Hello, I'm Hazel Dempster, and this is an analysis of An Irish Airman Forsees His Death by W.B. Yeats. This poem was written in 1918, so just at the end of World War I, and it's a dramatic monologue told from the perspective of an Irish airman just moments before his death in the skies. Now, it's widely accepted that this poem is based on Robert Gregory, who was the son of Yeats's close friend, Lady Gregory. Robert Gregory volunteered to fight in the First World War, and he was shot down in action. Yeats wrote 4 poems in total to commemorate Robert Gregory, and in fact was under some pressure to do so from Lady Gregory because she wished to have a lasting monument to remember her son. In this poem, Yeats imagines Robert Gregory's final moments before his death in the skies. Now, in terms of the literary context, Yeats in fact disliked war poetry in general. He expressed a distaste for it, and he stated that passive suffering is not a theme for poetry. So you can imagine that Yeats was in somewhat of a conundrum when writing this poem, because he disliked war poetry, he didn't wish to portray passive suffering, and yet he wished to commemorate Robert Gregory. So in this poem, Yeats resolves this by, instead of portraying Robert Gregory as a passive victim in the midst of war, he somehow transforms him into a hero who is imbued with foresight and control over his situation. And this is really the central concern of the poem, is this portrayal of this idealised figure. There's no mention of the war itself or of any conditions under which the war was fought under. It's entirely focused upon the airman. So let's begin to look at the poem in terms of the characteristics of the airman, how Yeats presents this ideal man. Well, firstly, he is given foresight, and that's clearly shown in the title, An Irish Airman Foresees His Death. He's given a kind of godlike omniscience. And this is continued in the first 2 lines of the poem, so if we turn to those now. They read, "I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above." So if we begin that by looking at that first line, there's an absolute certainty of his death. And the iambic stress is on know. I know that I shall meet my fate. The whole line is monosyllabic, and this is typical of the voice of this airman. It's simple and it's straightforward. And there's also, as part of that, a calm acceptance of his inevitable death. The second line gives us the location of his death, somewhere among the clouds above. So his death will take place in the romantic, with a capital R, romantic sphere of the clouds. And this presentation is softened by the vowel sounds of the lines. Somewhere among the clouds above. The line's much softer than the first line. And in terms of the proxemics, the airman is elevated above the ordinary mortal human level. He's literally flying above us, and that gives him a kind of transcendence and is very much linked to his portrayal of this ideal figure. So the second characteristic of this airman is the sense of locality that he has. So if we turn to lines 5 and 6, the airman says, "My country is Kiltartan Cross, my countrymen Kiltartan's poor." So this airman is not simply Irish, but he defines himself in relation to a very specific place, which is Kiltartan Cross. And this is a typical feature of Yeats' poetry, to locate it in such a specific area, usually of Ireland. Now, Kiltartan Cross is the village next to Cool Park, which is where Robert Gregory lived, so it's a real place. And it very much defines this airman. The repetition of Kiltartan clearly adds strength to that. And there's also a continued sense of this idealism because the airman aligns himself with Kiltartan's poor. The airman then goes on to reject the common motivations that you may assume he has for fighting. So in lines 3 and 4, he says, "Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love." So this is the opposite of what you'd expect. He has no hatred for the Germans and no love for Britain. There's some question of whether this really is reflective of Robert Gregory's feeling, but certainly in the portrayal of this idealised airman, it's true that he seems to be not motivated by those things at all, and he makes it clear that it makes no difference to those in Kiltartan Cross, those whom he really loves, the outcome of this war. Now, in terms of the language, we have these monosyllabic, very balanced, end-stopped lines, and that gives a real clarity to his voice. Now, he then goes on in 9 and 10 to give us more detail about what didn't motivate him to fight. So he says, "Nor law nor duty bade me fight, nor public men, nor cheering crowds." So he gives us a sort of list of dismissal of the typical political and social reasons that you may assume that someone would volunteer to fight in the war. And the anaphora of that word "nor" starting each phrase adds to the sense of the definite rejection of those traditional motives for fighting. Now, these lines precede the airman's real reason for fighting, and he gives it to us in lines 11 and 12. He says, "A lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds." So syntactically, what drives him is delight, the simple joy of flying, and Yeats attributes this pure romantic impulse to this airman. And when we look at the language, I mean, what a contrast to what's gone before. Instead of this list of negations broken up with caesura, we have this lovely flowing phrase. We come back to the clouds that were mentioned in the second line, and we come back to these long vowel sounds: lonely, impulse, delight, tumult, clouds. There's elongated vowel sounds which softens those lines and I think fills them with absorption and awe, which is reflective of the airman's feelings towards the delight and the joy that he has in flying. And finally, in this poem, Yeats imbues this airman with a great sense of balance and control, and we can see this in the structure of the poem or the versification. So in terms of the rhyme, the poem is divided into perfect A-B quatrains. So in other words, the poem's split up into groups of 4 lines, and in those 4 lines there are alternate rhymes, A-B. There are full rhymes throughout this poem, which gives it a very strong sense of certainty, as we've discussed before. And to add to the symmetry, we have 4 sets of quatrains. So 4 sets of 4 gives us a perfect square in terms of the structure of the poem. Now, the rhythm is iambic tetrameter. It's pretty regular throughout the whole poem, and it's 4 stresses a line. So if we look at lines 9 and 10, they're a great example of this. Nor law, nor duty bade me fight, nor public men, nor cheering crowds. We have a very certain rhythm throughout that. And if we look in even greater detail at the construction, we can see that this poem is actually only made up of 2 sentences. And you can guess that in a 16-line poem, the first sentence ends at the end of the 8th line. So it perfectly splits this poem. So overall, this is brilliantly controlled. And there are 2 reasons for that, I think. One is that it echoes the airman's internal state. He's poised and he's balanced. And the other reason is that it imitates flying, because of course flying requires balance, it requires equilibrium in the skies. And so Yeats is paying poetic tribute to this skill of this man of action. He's imitating the art of flying in the balance of his verse. This sense of balance is strengthened in the last quatrain of the poem, the last 4 lines, and I think these also end the poem with a calm reflection at the moment of death. So if we look at those: "I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath the years behind, in balance with this life, this death." I think it would be easy to misinterpret this phrase as negative, particularly if you took the word in isolation and just looked at waste of breath. But I think that in fact this is a moment of perfect harmony. He has an utter absorption in activity, a noble acceptance of death, and a clarity of understanding. and I think that the evidence of this interpretation is in the perfect symmetry of these lines. So let's look closely at the end of the poem. So in line 13 he says, "I balanced all, brought all to mind." And here the caesura exactly splits the line in half. So if you count the syllables, you'll see that it splits it exactly. We also have alliterative patterns of sound here: balanced, all, brought, all. So B-A, B-A, adding symmetry. Then in lines 14 and 15, the years to come seem waste of breath, a waste of breath, the years behind. This is an example of chiasmus, where the syntax of a phrase is reversed. So the years to come seem waste of breath, a waste of breath, the years behind. We get an inversion there. And this portrays, I think, the reflective order of the airman's mind. And finally, in line 16, in balance with this life, this death. Now here the caesura measures the moment between life and death. Now if we look at the quatrain as a whole, we see that there are patterns of repetition throughout. So in line 13 we have balanced, and in line 16 we have balance. So it's actually enveloping the quatrain in balance. And in the enclosed lines 13 and 14, as you'd expect in the chiasmus, there are going to be repetitions. So we've got years, years, breath, breath. And finally, we finish on the opposition of life and death. So overall, in this last quatrain, we really see this proportioned, harmonious pattern of language that draws the poem to a masterful close. And it's the final presentation we have of this ideal man of action. So if you're interested in this poem, you may also like to read two poems that are published in the same volume, The Whilst Ones At Cool. And the first poem is The Fisherman. Yeats also looks at an ideal in this poem, this time entirely imaginary, as he makes very clear, but also a skilled man of action. And you may also like to read Whilst Ones at Cool because it's centred on Cool Park, which is the estate of the Gregory family. So I hope you found this analysis useful. I'll be doing more of these video tutorials, and I do hope you'll be able to join me.